you very much. It's an honor for me to speak to you here today on storage and more in general on European policy when it comes to energy markets in general and gas markets in particular and storage. My name is Augustijn Van Haasteren, but I'm very much used to the fact that it is badly pronounced, so I react to anything which resembles that. Before I start the presentation, maybe I should take you a little step backwards to about 2004-2005. Energy markets were supposed to be regulated at least for large categories of consumers since 1999. And the regulatory framework was more or less in place. Competition law had not been applied very actively in the area. At the same time, we saw in the market that the liberalization and the increased competition which it was supposed to bring about was not really happening. A few years later, as final consumers, the households were going to be liberalized. If we were going to make this project a success, then we also had to make sure that it worked. So some action was required. So, in fact, DG Competition at the time took a little bit the lead in creating the momentum to get change happening. And we started what is called a sector inquiry. A sector inquiry uses certain powers under EG competition law, which allows us to use the investigative instruments without there being a specific suspicion against a given company. But it does go more in depth than by asking loads of information basically of companies and trying to understand what is happening. The results of that exercise were well, very useful in the sense that we knew what was going to happen, but also it made very clear that something needed to be done. First of all, market concentration had remained very high. In fact, when I say market concentration is very high, this is still an understatement for some countries. Further foreclosure is important. In fact, there were clear indications that the coexistence of companies which were vertically integrated with networks and other essential assets were using these essential facilities to hinder or at least reduce the speed by which entrants could enter the market. There was very clearly a lack of market integration. The usual, what you would expect to be the entrants, were not really entering in the neighboring markets. That was also related to infrastructure. Little interconnection capacity was also clear. If you enter a market as an entrant and you don't know anything about what is happening, then in fact you take quite a big gamble on your ability to struggle through. And in fact, there was a very big lack of transparency for the markets which needed to be dealt with. In general, there was a large distrust in price formation that had to do, to a large extent, also to lack of liquidity on the wholesale markets, which is still, in fact, the truth largely for gas today, and little competition in downstream markets. So we had to do something to foster the increased integration of the markets. We had to make sure that the networks were developed not for the owners of the networks, but for the interest of the European consumer. Well, competition is supposed to bring efficient and strong companies, and that we had to foster as well. This is not the same as saying that we need national champions, that would be very clear. And we had to balance this objective with other objectives like security of supply, sustainability, CO2 emissions, and so forth. The regulatory framework was in place, at least in some form. Competition policy had not been applied very actively. If we look at the regulatory framework, of course, is meant to prevent that primarily the companies do not exploit essential assets to the detriment of entrants and then to competition and final consumers. So if we were going to look for solutions to this problem, of course, reinforcing the regulatory framework was going to be one of the options. Another option was to say, well, if the regulatory framework is supposed to stop companies from using market power, of course, the competition rules are available to do exactly the same. So we could step up our enforcement policy and try to remedy the situation by imposing strict remedies on the companies which we had found to infringe competition law. In the end, a kind of dual approach was adopted. There was a proposal for the reinforcement of the regulatory framework, and at the same time, we used the information and the analysis we had made in the sector inquiry in order to bring a number of cases under competition law. And I will deal with those in turn. So in 2007, we proposed a new package to the member states. A very important part of that was an increased emphasis on unbundling. In fact, the Commission went into the discussion with the proposal to ownership unbundle the networks. Then it was very clear also that in some countries at least, regulators existed but didn't have sufficient powers, or in some countries, of course, that these regulators didn't exist, and therefore, and whereas they had proven to be quite useful in other countries, so we had to improve this. Reinforce the institutional framework for collaboration, at the one hand, between regulators, so that there could be an increased coordination between them, in particular for issues which related to cross-border, so interconnectors, for instance, and investments in them, and more deep cooperation between TSOs in order to make sure that the networks are truly integrated, also on the level on the grid codes, for instance. On the retail markets, there were some elements, but I think it's primarily a question of consumer protection where the emphasis was, not so much on competition, and transparency. The last point I mentioned is access to storage and LNG, where the proposal was the following. When it comes to unbundling, this needed to be reinforced. In fact, there were, when we did the sector inquiry, there were quite clear indications that storage were used for strategic purposes, but also that there was a lack of, for instance, Chinese walls between the data of the users of storage, which were entrants, and between the supply arms of the vertical integrated company which owned the storage, or that there were issues with, for instance, the cost allocation, so that there was a scope for cross-subsidization. So when it comes to unbundling, the proposed rule is that we will not just have a light form of unbundling with a non-discrimination rule, that we will reinforce that with legal and functional unbundling, a little bit like we had previously for the networks. Then when it comes to the access rules, previously already the options of regulated and negotiated TPA existed, but this will be reinforced by an increased transparency. Increased transparency in various ways, I would say. First of all, there were storage sites where if you would go there to ask for access to their storage, would say, well, we don't fall under these rules. And that had to do with a loophole in the directives which said that storage has to be made available to the extent necessary for technical and economical reasons. So member states will have to clarify now clearly in advance which criteria will apply for the regulation of their storage, and the regulators will look after whether indeed the storage do comply with these rules. So to close this loophole, basically. then the choice of regulated and negotiated TPA will continue to exist. Also, the choice has been made, at least by the Commission, that we will not regulate in the directives whether negotiated or regulated TPA will exist. In fact, the storage sites and the countries are too different for that. The geological structure of the underground, of course, the competitive structure of the market, the question whether you should make a distinction with old and new investments, and these elements means that there's too much variety. So we choose not to regulate this on the level of the directives, but the Matters Forum will be in charge of developing these rules. Then when it comes to negotiated TPA, there will be some reinforcement of the rule in the sense that whereas price is not regulated, the main conditions which have to be published will be reinforced so that it is clearer what you have before you start to negotiate, basically. And there will be much more transparency, we hope, on the capacity and the actual usage of the storage, various storages in Europe. This was the Commission proposal. The legislation has not yet been adopted, so it's not entirely clear yet which will be the end result. But when I see the various issues which are in the moment in the co-decision procedure, so the procedure between the Council and the Parliament to adopt it, then what do you see? First of all, the Parliament, contrary to what the Commission had proposed, wanted to regulate also on the level of directives when negotiated and when regulated TPA should apply to storage. We have two criteria: the independence of the storage operator. When it's not vertically integrated, of course, then maybe the need for the access rules is less high than in other instances. And what kind of competitive conditions exist in the relevant market for storage, but also in a wider perspective, which would then have to be controlled by the member states and the national regulatory authorities. There was a deletion of the legal and functioning unbundling. For the opponents of unbundling cheer, I think this is the result of a democratic accident, because in fact the Parliament, when it came to the networks, took the position that they wanted to have a stronger unbundling than came out of the Council discussions. And therefore deleted all references to functional and legal unbundling, thinking that it only related to the networks, but as an accident they also deleted this provision for the storage. But I think when the final decision comes, this will be put in again. The Council, there is one issue basically was very much stressed, was the confidentiality of the data in case there's only one user of the storage, basically. I mentioned earlier, transparency needs to be emphasized stronger, but there's also, of course, a confidentiality issue, and the Council mentioned that strongly. So whatever will come out of this, I think we can say that already now with some confidence that the regulation for storage will become stronger, but it will not be at the same level of the networks. And that is, of course, also logical if you see at the let's say, whereas networks can be clearly deemed essential facilities, this with storage is less evident that this is the case. And we need to adapt the regulation to that circumstance, meaning lighter, but also depending on a number of other factors which determine whether or not access to storage is should be regulated or not. And I come to competition law. For those not familiar with the instruments, there are basically three sets of them. There are the antitrust rules. Those relate to the prohibition on anti-competitive agreements and abuse of dominant positions by companies. the merger control, and the state aid control. The antitrust rules, especially since it's their reform in 2004, can be used in a very proactive way, where basically, as a competition authority, we can take a look at the market, get a feeling where the problem is, and then try to get it remedied under the competition rule. Previously, that was much more difficult. Therefore, it's proactive. The merger control, of course, is very reactive. Somebody has to merge first before we get to see it. And the state aid control, which I mention here pro memori, because it has a bit less to do with our current discussion today, but it is very important for energy in general. First of all, because we use them to bring cases against the existence of regulated tariffs in some countries which hinder competition, and I'm particularly speaking about France and Spain. And they play an important role because as DG Competition and the State Aid Enforcement Agency, we play a role in the allocation of CO2 emissions rights and the national allocation plans which exist. If you want to see the objectives of the antitrust rules, first of all, access to networks, access to generation capacity and gas, and access to customers. If these three elements are not reunited, entrants have no chance whatsoever. And if we want to increase competition, these barriers have to be removed. So we have been trying a little bit to find cases which foster these three objectives. First, if market integration is not happening, or at least not happening at a speed that would be favorable, then various reasons, of course, can exist. But one of these reasons can be that the companies have simply decided among themselves that it is much better that everybody stays in their own territory and that we don't compete. And that appears to have happened between Aon and Gaz de France, between France and Germany, where certain arrangements which predated liberalization and which meant that they could not sell gas within each other's countries were basically continued after liberalization. And whereas before liberalization, this wouldn't matter. After liberalization, of course, this becomes a constraint on competition and therefore maybe an infringement of Article 81. Access to network capacity. We took a case, for instance, in Germany where RWE tried by various, RWE, by various means tried to increase basically the costs of rivals on its own network, for instance, by the balancing rules which were very unfavorable to entrants, or by having a number of balancing zones which meant that also the transaction cost to be active in its territory would be much higher than otherwise would have been the case. This relates, of course, a little bit to storage, because this relates to the demand of storage on a short-term basis. Then the use of networks. We took a case, Aon, in the electricity field, which had two elements. First of all, there were indications that they have been withdrawing capacity from the electricity market with the specific aim to increase its prices, capacity withholding. And the second part related to the way they dealt with their network. That has to do with the manner in which, well, essentially, because they were vertically integrated and run the network, they could determine the rules of those companies which could bid in capacity for reserves, and they favored their own supply affiliate. So this is a network-related infringement. Both RWE and E.ON offered remedies to the Commission, and RWE offered to sell its gas network and high-pressure gas work in Germany, and E.ON offered to sell its high-voltage network also in Germany. That was part of the remedies of Aeon. The other part was the sale of 5,000 megawatts of capacity. In Greece, we did a case against the Greek state and PPC. That was a case brought under 86-82, where essentially the infringement related to the fact that the Greek government had given exclusive licenses to PPC for the exploitation of lignite deposits within Greece. And lignite is clearly the most, generation by burning lignite is clearly the most efficient way of producing electricity in Greece, which meant that any entrants would have no chance of building a competitive set of generation units, especially for baseload. Then we have also done a few cases downstream, especially in the market for large industrial users. For the gas, we brought a case against Distrigas. This was a case basically meaning that Distrigas had concluded a large number of contracts with large industrial customers, which were not just large in terms of the fact that they had contracted all the customers available, but also that they contracted them for a very long time and in exclusive contracts, so that in fact the amount of gas which became available on a regular basis, which would then could be contracted by entrants, was so low that you could not reach a significant foothold in the market within a reasonable amount of time. And cases very similar to these we have also brought in electricity markets against EDF, where we issued statement of objections at the end of last year, and against Suez. Suez then being, of course, the French company, but basically the electricity incumbent in Belgium. When it comes to antitrust enforcement, I think it's fair to say that although often we look at storage in order to get an idea about the competitive conditions in the market, the number of cases which we had brought specifically on storage is fairly limited. What I just wanted to put out is that when you look at the one aspect of the Iran electricity case, in fact, this is a kind of scenario we can also expect to exist in gas, where basically the vertically integrated transmission system operator, which has to buy, of course, the services in order to manage its network, basically favors its own subsidiary, gas storage, or other forms of flexibility for the management of its own network. And of course, I mentioned earlier, for instance, the RWE case related to storage because it focuses very much on the balancing rules. And of course, the balancing rules, in order to comply with them, you need flexibility. And when flexibility is needed, you look at storage. And therefore, it relates to the demand side of storage. When it comes to mergers, it is true, of course, that when we're dealing with mergers, first of all, we have a reactive attitude because we only start to look at mergers once they have been notified to us. At the same time, when you have a merger where competitive issues play a role, then you look at your conclusions which you have made previously about what did not work in the market, and you try to find remedies which, of course, take those elements into account. And then often you can do some things which also foster the objective of market integration. Just to take a few examples, GDF Suez. This was a merger which heavily affected the Belgian market because GDF was the important entrant in the Belgian gas market, was owning the second electricity producer in Belgium together with Centrica. And Suez was basically the gas and electricity incumbent in Belgium. So this merger was not looking very nicely for Belgium. In the process of trying to think of remedies which you could accept, also the issue of entry barriers came on the agenda. And entry barriers relate not only, but also to the management of the network. So in the context of this merger, we obtained that the gas network would become not completely ownership unbundled, but quite closely to that, and therefore also contributed to this objective of having, let's say, the networks unbundled and a more level playing field for entrants. In Ion Mol, a very similar situation arose, and also there some unbundling rules were reinforced. In Verbund Energieallianz, well, in the end it didn't happen, but this merger, but some remedies related to the balancing side of the market were also dealt with. In a number of cases, flexibility, storage, balancing rules, they play a role. Often it has to do with entry barriers, with the effects of the lack of flexibility on the competitiveness of entrants on downstream markets. But if you want to, the best case probably instructive for how we look at storage and balancing and alternative means of flexibility is a case which was, I think, notified in 2007, Dong Elsam Energy E2. So basically, this was a case it's concerning Denmark in particular, where Dong, the Danish gas incumbent and owner of all the storage in Belgium, the two storage sites in Denmark, wanted to merge with Elsam and Energy E2, which are the two electricity incumbents and the owners of a number of CHP units, which may be contrary to what you would expect, nonetheless have quite flexible characteristics. So the first question we had to deal with is that, is there a market for storage or storage products, or should we also take into account other forms of flexibility which may be available in the market? And elements of flexibility which we considered were, of course, physical storage, the modulation of gas demand, in particular then these central CHPs which were owned by Elsam and E2, which in fact could modulate their consumption of gas quite significantly, either by switching to different fuels, or within the generation park of the company to use more generation capacity which did not use gas relative to previously, or by making a buy or make decision basically that instead of producing with gas-fired plants, they would actually buy the electricity on Nord Pool, which at least in Northern Europe is a feasible strategy because the electricity markets are fairly liquid. And also the gas consumption was quite significant. So if they would change their consumption of gas, in fact the impact it would make on the total gas consumption in Denmark would be quite significant. Other forms of flexibility, like flexible upstream contracts, trading of gas, flexible contracts, line pack, or interruptible industrial customers were considered, but were excluded, at least for this analysis. For instance, the interruptible industrial customers were all contracted by the network operator for emergency purposes, and therefore were not available for a more general offer of flexibility on the market. Flexible products basically were hardly traded within Denmark, so did not constitute a really seriously substitute for other forms of flexibility. Flexible supply contracts did exist, were not greatly in number though. And in fact, most of the flexibility available in these contracts was upward, which of course limited their usefulness for, in general, as a flexibility source. But of course it existed. But in the end it was decided to exclude these from the market. And only focus on the physical storage and the possibility of demand modulation by the central CSPs. Just mentioned in passing that the market was national in scope, which related very much to the fact that in Sweden it was basically no storage, and in Germany storage conditions were very different. Well, Dong was clearly dominant, the market considered. They owned all the physical storage. In addition, they have flexible production in companies related to Dong in the offshore from Denmark, which they could use also as a form of flexibility. If there's line pack in Denmark and it is not to the TSO, then it belongs to Dong because they could use their offshore network in order to have some line pack flexibility available to them. Another possible source of flexibility could have been not so much the central CHPs, but which were LSAM and E2, but the decentralized ones. But they also had quite intensive business contracts with them. And to the extent there were contracts for flexibility available in Denmark, you had to contract with the Dong. So that was not also very inducive, of course, to good competitive conditions. So this operation was going to combine the two most important suppliers of flexibility. And was going to lead to significant lessening of competition. This is the new test on the merger regulation. We looked at some possible strategies of Dong in order to exploit its market power. For reasons which relate very much to the manner in which Dong was regulated. If you want to know all the details, I suggest you read the decision. It could increase the tariffs for storage by substituting its own demand for storage towards the LSAM E2 assets and giving the storage to competitors, or at least make them available for that. So it said it could raise its rivals' cost. And we also looked at the possible vertical effects. Storage costs are a significant part of supply cost, depends a bit on the market segment, but it is substantial. So in fact, the fact that they would have a reinforced dominant position on the market for storage or flexibility meant that they could also exploit this to exclude entrants in downstream markets. So all in all considered, this was an operation which was difficult to accept, and therefore they offered to divest one of the storages, the largest one in Denmark, and that has meanwhile been done. Well, storage is regulated. In Denmark, in fact, there is negotiated TPA, which goes a little bit further even that Dong offered at the time standard products for storage, which were priced. And there was in fact some storage available as a result of a previous competition law enforcement case, but done by the Danish competition authorities. But, and of course regulation had the same objectives as competition law. In fact, it wants to prevent that companies exploit their market power. So why would we bother in investing in applying the competition rules? But in fact, if you look carefully at the regulatory framework, the situation was that it basically was not solid enough in order to prevent Dong from exploiting its market power. And some indications for that were, well, the contracts which it offered primarily suited its own needs and were not tailored to any needs of its competitors. Even if the conditions were, contractual conditions were part of the set prior to the negotiations, in fact, Dong had the possibility, and apparently had used it occasionally, to change them unilaterally. And in addition, the non-standard contracts were priced higher. And I mentioned earlier that also the regulator had not all the powers maybe necessary to prevent that cost-based regulation would really work. So this meant that the frontier, which you could apply maybe between ex post and ex ante regulation, is in fact often designed in a very detailed way, depending on the specifics of a particular country. And I would even say it's liable to move around, because Dong had appealed some of the decisions of the Danish regulator and won, which in fact showed the weaknesses of the Danish regulatory system, and which then provided us basically with an argument to say that it was not sufficient. This is a bit a cynical comment maybe, but this is really what happened. Just one slide on CSDDF. There was also an issue with flexibility in storage there. This slide only relates to the vertical effects between gas and electricity. So the dominant, basically because the dominant gas supplier in Belgium would be able to raise its rival's costs, and the flexibility came in the picture there because, well, they were dominant on the gas market and could also increase simply the price of gas in general, but they were in fact also very important as a supplier of flexibility. Belgium has only one storage. In fact, the more important source of storage is upstream flexibility, which of course you only have if you have a large portfolio, i.e. the incumbent. And there was a second strategy basically available for the incumbent. It's also the electricity assets, so also the incentive to try to affect price on the electricity market, to use its gas resources to exclude competitors from the electricity markets, by not just by increasing its price, but also by making their plants less efficient, because gas plants are the margin. That means that in Belgium, so that means they need the flexibility in order to run their plants efficiently, and the flexibility, even more than the gas, was in the hand of the incumbent. And therefore we look quite carefully also in this particular case to the flexibility arrangements. So, what can I say? In the context of the overall reinforcement of the regulatory framework, also in storage, I think we will be able to take a step forward for the access to storage. Because of its particular characteristics, the regulation though, or the requirements of that, will remain relatively light relative to networks in particular, and will be more flexible. I refer to, for instance, the Madrid process, where there they will set the criteria whether negotiated or regulated TPA will apply. And which means that depending on the country and depending basically the frontier of ex ante and ex post regulation will be different. Some countries' storage will remain very lightly regulated, and others it will be highly regulated, which means, of course, depending on where this frontier will be set, also competition law enforcement will remain important to see whether the storages may or may not have been used for anti-competitive purposes. I hope by explaining some of the issues in the merger case we have done, I give you some idea about how we would deal with these kind of cases. And of course I also read with interest the book on the chapter on market power and storages to get any inspiration for our next cases. Thank you very much. This was what I was going to present. And